A moment of encounter. My brother and I belong to a generation of black people in Britain who were acutely aware of our outsider status, meaning that the seemingly avalanche of vituperation aimed at black people in the media had led us to rejecting Britain as a country just at the time when Britain was largely rejecting us. By the time Paul Gilroy had published his seminal text on black positionality in Britain, there ain't no black in the Union Jack. The die was cast for me and my younger brother. We were already post-colonial refuseniks. We were anti-colonial, socially discontent, critically sceptical black young men living in Britain. The die had been cast on the moment we had witnessed Viv Richards stroking the cricket ball majestically around the Oval on the final test of the scorching hot summer of 1976. Oh, would those days come back again? My brother and I watched on in a state of unadulterated joy as we witnessed the West Indies cricket team, a team of all black Caribbean people like ourselves, defeating an all-white English team captained by a white South African who was going to make us grovel. It never occurred to us that we should support England. It never occurred to us that our allegiance or our love might lie with a team of Englishmen, even though we were and indeed are English. And herein lies the rub, and I have to confess that this is a highly political polemic that struggles with the notion that cultures, of course, are not static. That although I support the West Indies cricket team and would identify the Caribbean as perhaps my ancestral home, in a more immediate sense beyond that in terms of Africa, the truth is I'm British, I have a Yorkshire accent, and this is my habitual home. And so, as our previous speaker said, there are indeed actually complexities around how we name ourselves in terms of nation. I realise that I'm also a child of my time. I'm aware that indeed cultures are not static, and I come from an era, an oppositional era, that was rooted in anti-colonialism and identity politics. That is not quite the same now as it was perhaps in the 70s and 80s. And I have to confess that part of the struggle even within how we understand what it is to be black in Britain, and people do whole PhDs on this stuff, that my take is a particular take. It's not one that would be shared by lots of black people, and certainly not by a lot of black Christians in Britain. But one of the elements, therefore, around that is that I see my sense of belonging and love of country always in the contested way in which we understand what it means to love and to belong. It's interesting to note that in terms of sport, I don't support England at anything. That when I was growing up, partly because I suppose I lived in Yorkshire and I suppose Leeds United, and Leeds United's best players were Scottish, I actually had more love for the Scottish football team than I did for the English team.
Amen.
You may well say that, but because I did get a lot of stick when England lost 5-0. When Scotland lost 5-0 at England at Wembley, and in goal was a Scottish Leeds goalkeeper. But it's interesting that I often tend to use the term African Caribbean as my nomenclature of choice. I'm rarely, if ever, black British. Of course, I know that I am black British, but there's a sense in which I tend to identify myself with my diasporan roots, African and Caribbean, in terms of the historical journeys, the roots that have taken me here, rather than something that is predicated upon a particular sense of belonging in a context where I think black bodies and the bodies of others have always been so contested that notions of belonging are complex. I take seriously the fact that from your studies you have been able to identify that people who have a clear sense of their ethnic and racial identity would assert to being patriotic. I think what I would contest with that, I'm not saying you're wrong, just that is the notion of signifying, the fact that historically the ways in which you belong is by mimicking the tropes of belonging as a way of safety. that essentially if a white authority figure comes to you and says, do you belong? Well, of course, actually, you say you do, because quite frankly, historically, you'd be stupid to say you don't. Because that would be used against you. I want to particularly look, above the time, it's quite a long paper, I want to look particularly at the notion of whiteness, belonging, and English identity. And I want to say specifically English identity, because I think it works slightly differently in terms of Wales and Scotland and some of the other contexts. But I want to go back to Paul Gilroy's seminal text, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, which was predicated on the normative assumptions that there is a link between belonging and English identity and notions of whiteness. That the plethora of immigration laws, of course, have been enacted over the past 40 or so years would have seemed to attest to this relationship. That it's interesting that in all the discourse around what is good race relations is always predicated on the basis of having less black bodies in the country. And by black, I use that also in the political sense to mean all people are non-white. But I want to argue that it's not just within the imagined, mythologized mind of the right-wing adherents that there was a symbiotic relationship between whiteness and the nation of belonging in Britain. The economic construction of the post-Second World War Britain that was very much predicated on the privileges of whiteness when juxtaposed with the seeming casual dismissal of black and minority ethnic people as cheap labour in the industrial rebuilding of the nation. Indeed, it should be noted that my own parents were encouraged to leave the Caribbean to come to Britain in order to rebuild the economy. Whiteness as a concept is complex and a contested phenomenon. A number of scholars have explored the nature of whiteness and its concomitant relationship to notions of privilege and superiority. It should be noted that scholars have argued about the seeming homogeneous construct of whiteness as being one of privilege and superiority that does not take account of the realities of dispossession and disaffection that exist within white working class communities. And I certainly would agree with you that I think that one of the problems with multiculturalism that it didn't give white working class people a positive identity that everyone else was given. I remember growing up in primary school and we were sent off to our different classes in order to affirm our heritage. I remember being introduced to a steel pan, and there was this kind of so-called, I guess, form of sort of liberal essentialism that assumed that actually giving me a steel pan, I would just naturally know how to play it because it was ingrained in my genes. And I looked and thought, well, I've never played one of these in my whole life. I quite frankly, I'd rather go with the white kids and listen to Slade. There wasn't really anything that kind of affirmed what was white working class Yorkshire tradition, even though that is as much part of my identity as the stories I'm giving here at the moment in time. But I still want to say that not ignoring the privations that have faced marginalised white working class communities. I don't want to ignore that, and I accept that poverty and disadvantage and marginalisation are no longer so particularly colour-coded, that essentially there is as much vicious poverty and disaffection amongst white working class communities on outer estates as they are within inner city contexts in terms of disaffection amongst poor black and Asian people. But what is often missed is the symbolic power of being white that has been accrued over centuries that transcends the economic and materialist basis of its hegemony. I do not dispute that poor white working class people also experience marginalisation and cultural emotional deprivation and sense of alienation from the nation. And I hope it's not the case that as a black theologian I'm guilty of asserting that only black people suffer. But the transcendent power of whiteness lies in its corrosive power in the nature of its symbolic rendering as a signifier for that which is normative and acceptable. That if I had £1 for every time I've sat down and listened to very, very good erudite white scholars who talk in abstraction, you say, okay, well, just exactly who you're talking about. And of course the truth is their normative position is whiteness, but because it doesn't state it, it becomes universal by not having to name its complex contextuality. As the black British theologian, my friend and colleague David Zero suggested, there's long been a symbiotic relationship, for example, between Englishness and whiteness. within the nation state of Great Britain. It's interesting to know that even as we speak, as aberrant as their thought is, that two expressions of right-wing politics in Britain, British National Party and the English Defence League, both style themselves as Christian parties, whose aim is to safeguard the Christian heritage of Britain. And when we make Christian heritage of Britain, it's interesting that oftentimes we don't predicate within that the fastest growing expression of Christianity, which of course is black Christianity. It's interesting that in all the literature about Christian Britain, for example, being on the demise, known within that, even if, no, I think the most you get, I think, is in one paper done by Peter Browley. There was a footnote that says, well, of course, we accept that Christianity is on the wane, but like we do note that black Christian churches seem to be growing. That's a footnote. The relationship between colonialism and empire still remains the elephant in the room within theological discourse, not necessarily within sociological or cultural. When I quote Robert Beckford, my much more well-known compatriot here, who says, and I quote, "I would say that theology is the last bastion of white supremacy in Britain. Most disciplines have woken up to the need to engage with critical theory. They've engaged with diversity at its core, thinking more critically and constructively about how they shape things. Sociology students here at Goldsmiths University take courses in critical whiteness. In theological circles, they think you are dealing with tablecloths that they have at different times of the liturgical year." End of quote. At the time of writing, it is interesting to note the paucity of theological texts that have looked seriously at the relationship between normative whiteness, empire, and the notion of Christian Britain. In fact, I can only think of 5. Of equal importance is the internalised damage that anti-blackness, the most corrosive aspect of the flip side of hegemonic power of whiteness, has exerted upon the black psyche. In my last book, I spoke of the way in which the notion of Christian Britain, and I accept that it's complex, because it then gets tied up then with Islamophobia and looking at Islam. But again, it's interesting that with the exception of my brother's book, no one takes seriously the fact that many black people of African descent are also Muslims. Very little work has been done upon Somalian communities, who themselves are excluded even from other aspects of Islam by other people who are Muslims who claim not to be sectarian. Anti-blackness exists therefore in lots of places, even within Islam, who are also constructed as the other. But it was just interesting to note that in the fieldwork I did, I came across a number of black people, black Christians, who would assert that they were going to vote for the BNP because they themselves wanted to defend Christian Britain. Much I could say about that, but you need to buy the book, but obviously it's not very positive. But they assert that because it seems to them that in order to be a good Christian, it means that you have to be less black. And the rhetoric of anti-blackness, I think, has so permeated the way in which we work with our colourblind notions of belonging that, of course, it then almost seems axiomatic that somehow one has to be less of one thing in order to assert something else. It's very interesting to note that the context of privileged whiteness gets played out in lots of interesting ways. It's interesting that white Europeans, even the ones who Britain were sworn enemies with in the Second World War, have an easier time accessing the country than the people from the Commonwealth who fought for Britain, who can't come. The moment that politicised me in terms of becoming a theologian was being a youth and community worker in Handsworth 20 years ago. And I remember it clearly. There was a man, and I'll mention his name, he's dead now, called Adrian Christian, who had paid his own fare from Jamaica to Britain, volunteered, paid his own money to come and fight for Britain, paid his own money from Jamaica, where he could have easily stayed, in order to fight for the mother country, and then went back to Jamaica. Some 20-odd years later, when he was infirmed and his children wanted to bring him back into the country, he was not allowed into the country because his presence wasn't conducive to good relations. Good enough to fight for and die, but not good enough to live here, but a white German could come any time they liked. Because being white still makes you more accepted. So black theology in Britain has taken admittedly a very polemic challenge to critiquing normative whiteness. It has reminded us that there is indeed an embodiedness to all our discourse, that all theologies are some type of theology. All discourse is governed by the body, the materialistic relationship of the body in which we live, which of course is complex. So of course, and part of the danger, I accepted all this before you even asked the question, so let me throw in my defence first, is that of course there's always a danger of a kind of essentialism here. That, of course, black is incredibly complex, and I'm aware of the fact that even as I speak with a particular ideological marker in mind that is not shared by other people. Just very, very quickly, I'm aware of the time. One of the great existential crises in the Reddie family happened a few months ago, which is when my 8-year-old nephew Noah said to his father, Daddy, I want an England football shirt. I like Frank Lampard. And his dad phoned me up and said, Anthony, what the hell am I going to do? I said, I can't buy him an England football. It's England! And I'm thinking, so of course at this point I've got part academic hat on and part pastoral hat on. So academically I'm saying, I understand, you know, we're both post-colonial refuseniks, we don't support England. On the other hand, I said, but obviously being, you know, obviously as his uncle, you can't deny him the opportunity. He's not from our generation. Different context. In the end, of course, my brother fudged it and bought him a Brazilian football shirt instead. Number 10 for Kaka. So even as I give this, I acknowledge my own limitations even as I speak, but I suppose that part of the rhetoric, I suppose, of black theology is, if it does nothing else, it at least throws up the ways in which concealed and tacit forms of discourse are embedded within our body politic around what it means to belong or what it means to be perceived as the other. Whilst at the same time still acknowledging its problematics. I want to finish by coming back to cricket, that's where I started. That it seems to me that one of the critical ways in which the black otherness I think has a positive regard in the context of talking about patriotism is to at least remind us of the assumptions around what it often means, certainly visibly and symbolically, to belong. It's interesting that even as we speak, the dynamics of 1976 still look rather similar. Okay, the Westerns are absolutely crap these days, let's be perfectly frank about that. But it's still an all-white team captained by a white person born in South Africa against an all-black team. In the current team, there are actually 3 South African borns. It's easier if you're born in Pretoria to play for England than it is if you're born in Brixton. But of course, within that, and on this, I borrowed unashamedly from the great C.L.R. James in his book, if you've never read it, called Beyond the Boundary, which is still perhaps the best socio-political and cultural critique of cricket. His basic metaphor, his basic sense is, if you think cricket is just a game, then you haven't understood even the basic, deepest symbolic way in which it operates. And it's interesting that that's a game that was exported to the, largely to the colonies, not football, cricket. And cricket, he says, is really fascinating because there's a sense in which the rules are the same, but the intent with which how it's played tells you everything about how people invest particular energies into that. That, going back to the era in which I grew up, there was something about the way in which Viv Richards batted that was still the same game, but the intent of how he played it was entirely different. And very, very different from coming from Yorkshire and growing up with Jeff Boycott. It's still the same game. You're still defined by the same rules, but the intent of how it's played is different. And I think there's something of the metaphor of cricket and the way in which the game is played and the passion with which it's held, I think, that has offers for me a metaphor for how one negotiates the sense of being black and being other. I don't want to apologise for that, and I want to critique all the common sense notions, and particularly the tacit notions that link belonging and patriotism to a kind of implicit whiteness, even if we're not always aware of how that gets done. And part of the thing about Viv Richards or Lara or Michael Holden or West Indies cricket, as I said, sadly, in the past and not the present, is that it offers a different intent, a different way of seeing. It doesn't set up a separate game, and it's interesting that part of the beauty, I think, of the developments of black identities in Britain is that they're not being predicated on the lines of separatism as they have within other contexts and other parts of the world. It's how you negotiate within the common space, playing the same games and the rules, and yet you are unapologetically yourself and different in doing so. Some of which was picked up in the first presentation from Matt. I'll stop there. Thank you.